Hi there, and welcome to Office Hours with Distinctions for Life. I'm your host, Ron Davis. Thank you for tuning in. I began these live streams during the great pandemic. I began these live streams during the great pandemic of 2020 as a chance to connect with interesting people. And there's very little format to them, and their purpose is whatever I want it to be at the time. And today is a great example of kind of random choices. It's not. Well, I'll explain how we ended up here today. Normally, we're talking about entrepreneurship, or we're talking about personal development, or many different things. And today, I'm going to have our guest today is Paul Anthony Thomas, and Paul runs a company, an organization, whatever. He'll explain it to you, called Custom Private Equity, and part of that. That is now the Custom Private Equity podcast, which I am helping him with. He's the expert, and I'm the newbie. If any of the viewers here remember back in the day when I did my EMS podcast, I was the newbie there. I don't know anything. Still having cam problems, but I don't know anything about private equity, which makes me perfect for this particular podcast because Paul knows it all, and I just ask the questions that everybody else would ask. And we were doing one of our episodes. Which, by the way, if you want to subscribe to the podcast, you can go to customprivateequity.com and click on the podcast button, and it will give you information on how to subscribe to that podcast. But on one of these podcasts that we were recording, it was soon after the price of oil went negative, and I was asking Paul what that meant, and he explained it to me, and then it all made a whole lot more sense. And so that's why I got him on the show, which this doesn't really have anything to do with the Distinctions for Life in the normal sense. But it was such an interesting facet of something that I didn't know that I wanted to get Paul on the show. While he's on the show, I will fix my camera. What I'm going to do now is introduce Paul. Hi, Paul, and welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm fine, Ron. How are you?
I am good, and I am going to ask you the question I ask all guests and let you answer that. Take myself off the screen and fix this camera problem and turn off the air conditioner that I forgot to turn off. So, Paul, what is it that you do, and how did you come to do it?
Well, Ron, the basics of what we do is we do market research, and we create investment platforms for wealthy investors, people that have money that need to put that money to work, and they need to live off the revenues off of it, and they need really solid investments to put their money in. So my father started my investment career when I was about 13 years old, and we used to study the stock market and study the bond markets and commodities markets, and we also studied hard assets, and we wrote a newsletter. He would write it, and I would edit it for him. I was in the 5th grade, so he was writing to the 5th grade level. And I would edit this newsletter. It was called New Horizons for Investors. And he was a money manager and an asset manager, and in the oil and gas business. He had a doctorate in geology and a master's in mechanical engineering. And he was a very highly educated person. Bought his first stock in 1926, I believe, and before the Great Depression, and worked his way through the Great Depression as a young investor and entrepreneur type person. I graduated from LSU, and he was a great investor and a very conservative investor, and he was always out looking for investments that would pay off all the time, pay off every month, would put money in your bank account, and issue you a really great return on your money. I mean, his target was about 20%, which is my target today. And we really don't try to get involved in investments that make much less than 20% on your money every year on the amount of money that you have invested. Sometimes we're really successful at that, and sometimes we're not very successful at that. So, but we do market research. We develop, once we find a niche market, we feel comfortable and confident we'll make a 20% return on our money, then we'll put together a platform, an investment platform. So an example of an investment platform today is last month we launched a distressed assets energy fund. It's called the Ledger Energy Opportunities Fund. And it's a $25 million fundraise where we are raising the money to go out and buy assets that are in the oil and gas and energy business. We all types of assets in the energy business because they're about to come to market over the next year or two. They're going to come to market relatively cheap. We've seen bankruptcies already start. Today is May 5th, Cinco de Mayo Day, and 2020, and we're right in the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the economy is still pretty well shut down, and oil companies are starting to go bankrupt already, and it's only been 2 months, 3 months into the deal. So the long-term effects of $20 oil are going to be tremendous bargains to be had. People that are majority of the oil and gas industry is over 55 years old, so a lot of them are ready to retire anyway. And this is going to push them over the edge, and they're just going to want to retire and sell their assets and go play golf. And that's going to happen, and it's happened in the past. It happened in the 80s, and we're going to see it happen again today. And it's a dynamic time for us because these dramatic and drastic times in the oil business very rarely come around, where you see the price go from $50 to $10 or even a negative dollar amount. That's never happened in the history of the commodities exchanges. The prices going negative, and that's I think the primary topic we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, that is it, and sort of the structure of these are related, which is something I didn't know. The structure of how oil is, what the oil market means, and what it is. And before we talk about that, I wanted to just tell my viewers, like a lot of times I don't think people understand like what the stock market is. Like they understand that a stock is a piece of a company, but they don't understand that like how the thing that does the trading works, for lack of a better word, and how prices are futures, meaning that they're what people are thinking it's going to be actually worth in the future. You know, kind of that I'm overly simplifying this greatly, but I think a lot of times people just kind of think of the stock market as this: you're buying a piece of a company and something's going to happen, and maybe your stock will go up. They don't really have an idea of it, or they even think of it more like gambling, where you're just buying something and betting on it. And there's a lot of subtlety, and then when you start like getting a little more sophisticated as an investor in the market, you start seeing that there's all different kinds of ways to sell these pieces of a company, right? You can buy options, you can buy shorts, you can go long, and you get all this stuff going on, and you start understanding the market a lot deeper. But I had no idea how the oil market works. So the oil as a commodity, and we could talk a little about what commodities are, but in this particular case, we're talking about a single commodity, oil. Actually, we're not talking about a single commodity. We had this discussion too, with like there are multiple kinds of oil that are for sale. But let's start with when the news picks up and says oil is now negative in price. Are they saying, and this is I think what most people think, is that a buyer can go out into West Texas where someone is pumping oil out of the ground, and they would have to pay a negative price to get that oil, which doesn't even actually make sense. But that's not really what's going. Can you kind of explain what happens? So the oil comes out of the ground. A producer's pulling that out of the ground. I know you have a lot of experience in this, and even one of the platforms that you have does this. And then that oil, what happens to it between then and say it ends up at a refinery? So you can kind of explain the journey that takes and sort of the business of each piece of that.
Sure. That's a great question, actually. So basically, when oil is pumped out of the ground, the person who pumps it out of the ground is called an oil producer. I'm an oil producer. We own oil wells. We own an interest in 300 oil wells, actually located in 5 different states around the U.S. And I'm actually an oil operator. So the oil operator is the person who actually pumps the oil out of the ground and puts it in storage tanks on his lease. That's the primary way it happens today. So as this oil sits on this lease, then an oil purchaser will come along and he will buy this oil. And whenever you have a load of oil ready, a load of oil is about 180 barrels. A barrel is 42 gallons. So 180 barrels of oil. And you say, I've got 180 barrels. You call him on the phone, say, I've got a load to pick up. And he comes out and he picks it up with his truck. and he charges you a transportation fee, and he transports it to a pipeline where he injects it into a pipeline. He actually puts it into a big, massive storage tank, and they run that oil into the pipeline 24 hours a day. And that pipeline might be located in Big Spring, Texas, or Midland, Texas, as an example. And that the injection points in Midland, and that pipeline actually goes to. Sometimes they go to Cushing, Oklahoma, which is the hub for where oil trades in the United States. It's a centrally located area. Or it might go to the Gulf Coast to one of the refineries and they buy it. So if, for instance, we have a lease, Sunoco is the name of the company that buys the oil on one of our leases. They come to our lease. They take away 170 to 180 barrels. They take it to their injection point. They put it in their tank. And when they pick it up and put it on their truck, they own that oil. They've bought it from us for what we call the field price. So the field price normally has a deduction off of the standard posted price of West Texas Intermediate crude, which is the type of crude we sell in West Texas, versus the NYMEX crude, which is NYMEX crude contracts, which are traded in New York. So this Sunoco buyer has a contract with a pipeline. He has a contract with the just for example, the Alon refinery in Big Spring, Texas. He has a contract to deliver them 5,000 barrels a month, which is 5 contracts. So a contract is 1,000 barrels. If you hear people say, I bought a contract of oil, they bought the future delivery of 1,000 barrels of oil. So it's 42,000 gallons. That's a lot. That's the size of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. It's a very large thing. Yeah. So he takes this oil and puts it in, injects it, and he's bought it from us, and he uses our 180 barrels to fulfill part of his monthly contract. So he has a monthly contract with Exxon or Alon in Big Spring, or one of the refineries in Oklahoma, or a lot of there's huge refineries down around Texas City and down along the Gulf Coast. He might have a contract for, if he's a big buyer like Sunoco, he might have a contract for 1 million barrels a month. Well, on the commodities market, there's about let's say there's about 500,000, I guess 500,000 contracts that are out there. So the United States uses about 20 million barrels a day, give or take a little. It's down now to about 12 million barrels a day, which is a lot. A 30% decline in the oil demand is a huge deal. So, but today, let's say it's 12 million barrels today. So throughout the country, there are people that are supplying oil to this 12 million barrels a day that the United States uses today in 2020, in April of 2020, where that should go up to 15 to 20 million barrels a day by the end of the year, as long as we get through this COVID crisis and people go back to work. But that's the kind of demand shift we're talking about. So he's got this contract to deliver 1 million barrels a month to the refinery in Big Spring, Texas, that makes gasoline. So they take this oil and they crack the gasoline out of it, they crack the diesel out of it, they crack the asphalt out of it, they crack the light ends. There's natural gas that comes out when they crack this. So they send it up in a big cylinder and crack out all the different weights of oil. And then they sell those different products: diesel, gasoline, motor oil, asphalt, on up the line, all the way up to ethane and methane. Those are done in a natural gas plant, but they crack natural gas just like they do oil. So
yeah. So the things that interested me that we were starting, and sorry, still having camera problems, fixing that, was that these negative prices are based on contracts, and those contracts, if you're someone like Exxon, for instance, let's say ExxonMobil, and you're going to be needing to produce gasoline for as long as your company exists, right? And so you didn't just buy this oil from last month, right? You made some of these contracts you bought years ago because you were going to need it.
That's right.
And so that means that there are contracts that have different delivery dates that can go out years, and that affects the price. of those contracts. Can you talk a little about how those contracts work? So we've already established, by the way, just to recap, we've already established that a contract is for 1,000 barrels of crude oil, or 1,000 barrels of oil out of the ground. And but these contracts are bought. They can be bought as early as last month's oil, or as a month ago, or they can have been bought 5 years ago. So can you kind of explain that?
So if you own this multi-billion-dollar refinery in Texas City, Texas, and you're Exxon Mobil or Sunoco or somebody that you Citgo, like the Venezuelan people have Citgo as a national oil company, you want to know that you have supplies of oil for the next 5 years. You want to know that you have those tied in, and that you know what those costs are. And then as the time comes closer, you're going to make up whatever you don't have. You're going to go out into the marketplace. You're going to buy, like today, if I knew in December I wasn't going to have but 5 million barrels and I needed 5,500,000 barrels for December, I would go out and buy December contracts today to make up the other 500,000 barrels. So, and I would pay today's price for that month's contract. So today, the contracts in June of 2020, contracts are selling for $20 a barrel. Well, in December, the contracts are priced at $28 a barrel. Let's just say, I don't know what they are, I haven't looked at them, but just say they're 28. They expect the price to be $28 a barrel. So if I was an oil buyer at Exxon or Sunoco or somebody, I would say, okay, I'm going to need those barrels in December, and I'm happy with the $28 oil price. I'll go out and buy those contracts. And he might buy 500 of them. But he's actually what they call a wet barrel deliverer. So he's actually going to take possession of those barrels. He's going to put them in his storage tanks in Houston, and he's going to refine that oil. Well, 99% of the market, only 1% of the market is wet barrels. The rest of it is what they call paper barrels. So 99% of the market is speculators out there speculating that the price, instead of being $28 a barrel in December, is going to be $29 a barrel in December. And they're going to go out and they're going to buy those contracts at 28, and they're going to hope to sell them in December at 29 and make $1,000 of contract.
Right. So that is, and that was the thing that that you surprised me on, was the fact that, so in a way, a contract is, because it can be out to time, is a little like a stock option in the sense that you're buying the option to buy this oil in the future. But it's different from a stock option in that when the future comes, you have to buy it. If it is gone, if the price of oil has gone down, but you said you were going to buy it at, like, say if it's $20 now, but you said you were going to buy it 3 years ago at 50, like you gotta give them $50 to fulfill that contract, right?
Right. And you're stuck in the deal. That's right. Right.
And so what you're trying to do as this time comes forward, because you can't just, as you put it, the guys are in Chicago, they can't just have a tanker pull up on, in the lake there in Chicago and give them this oil. They don't have any, they're not these wet barrel people, right? They don't have anything to do. They've got to get rid of that contract.
Right.
And they've got to get rid of it because somebody has to take the oil. And that is where the negative price comes from.
That's right. So in the marketplace, in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, called the CME Group, there's a market maker, and his job is to match the buyers with the sellers. So there might be 10,000 buyers and sellers at any one time in a contract, where only 100 of those are actual wet barrel buyers. So the paper barrel buyers or contracts they match them together. And this contract might say, as you said, I'm going to buy those barrels for $50. Well, today's price is $20. Well, usually you're stuck in that contract for $30. So when it comes down to it, when it comes down to settlement day, which is the Friday before the end of the month, is settlement day, you have to get rid of that contract. If you don't, if you hold that contract at the end of Friday on settlement day, you own those barrels, and somebody on Monday is going to call you and say, okay, how do you want these barrels delivered to you? So that's when you're trading in the hard options or the hard, actually contracts. Now there are options behind all of this stuff. So I can buy contracts of oil for delivery in December. And then if I think the price is going to stabilize or go down in some way, I can go out and I can buy a put against that contract that I own. It's called a covered put. or I can, if I think the price is going to go up, I can buy a covered call, and I own the oil, and I can call out and say, okay, I'm going to sell. I bought it at 50. I'm going to sell it to you for 55, and I'm going to make money when settlement date comes around.
Right.
So, and there's a guy in the middle of the transaction that's making all this happen. He's securing the contracts. He's the trader that's securing. He's called a market maker, and he's securing the contracts and putting them with the right people.
Right. So to go back to what I think people are perceiving is going on when they say there's a negative price, is that we've now established that negativeness is people who bought contracts way back when that are now upside down, and they're having to sell those. They're having to pay people to take that oil and to take it away because they're having to pay so much higher, and that's why they have a negative price. But in the oil field, that's different because you know, as an oil producer, you have some control over how much you produce. And you can say, I'm not going to pull it out of the ground at $10 a barrel, right? Or $20 a barrel. I'm going to stop doing that kind of production. There's not a point where you have to sell the oil. So what does it look like when oil 2 months ago, let's see, what was it? Let me think, because we had this discussion a few weeks ago. So in March, beginning of March, oil was selling for 28, right? And like the beginning of April, it was selling for 15, 16. Is that right?
Yeah, right. That's right.
So what does it look like for you as a producer? Tell me, step us through what happened in March, or you know, what you delivered March, what you deliver April, what you are thinking is going to happen in May.
So on March 1st, that's a great question. So on March 1st, the price of oil was in the high 40s, $45, $50, between $45 and $50. And then over March, the price came down to the low price in March was about $17. So the way they price this is they use a 30-day moving average. So the March 1st to March 30th is they average those closing prices for that crude oil barrel, and they buy those crude oil barrels on average, monthly average. It's called a 30-day moving average. So they paid us in March. We received about $42 to $43 a barrel, depending on where our oil was sitting. In April, from April 1st to April 30th, we got $17 a barrel. So the average April contract price over the month was about $17.51 or so, and then they have to deduct the transportation off that, which is somewhere around $1 a barrel. So we're actually going to get a check for we produced 1,000 barrels last month, so we're going to get a check for $16,000, which in January that check would have been $50,000.
Right.
Yeah, so that's the dynamic there. So right now in April, starting April 1st, I told my pumper in the field, I said, don't only produce the well every other day. So now we're producing half as much as we were. We still need to sell some because we have to pay our electric bill. We have to pay our pumper. We have to pay the guy that goes out every day and takes care of the well. We have to pay our insurance. You know, there's things that we have to pay. So we have to have enough to pay those things, enough sales. Even at $12 a barrel, we have to have enough sales to pay those basic costs. But there are a lot of oil operators out there that are not even able to do that. We're lucky because we're in the right kind of properties that are going to sustain us, and we don't have any debt against our properties. So where the real opportunity lies for people like me is to buy out oil operators that have a bunch of debt, and they have to make bank payments on top of their electric bill and their insurance and everything. So the very interesting thing about that is that this is a great opportune time for us in the oil and gas business because we know what's going to happen in the future. We've been here half a dozen times over the last 50 years. We know that what's going to happen. So it's not a mystery to us. Yeah. We just don't know how long it's going to take.
Yeah. And that's so you guys you've cut back production, which of course is what everybody's doing, right? Everybody is cutting back production, which means you're changing the supply side. Right. Really, the whole change there were a couple of things that happened. As I put this, the tragedy behind the tragedy was what was going on with oil. But a big chunk of that, like you said, 30% or I think you said 40% drop in demand.
Right.
Yeah, so 40% drop in demand in basically a 2-month period. That's kind of unprecedented. In addition to having other producers drop their price and therefore part of the bales down. So there's a price war that went on in this same area, this same time frame with Russia and OPEC, right? Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, Russia and OPEC were fighting. They've been fighting for a couple of years over the different markets, over the China market and the European market. So
right, and so that happened right as the drop happened, and that's why we have these dramatic drops in such a very short period of time. Have you ever seen that quickly of a drop? I mean, I know you've seen things go down. I live in West Texas. We're used to having oil busts, but this quickly?
no, I've never, and it's never gone negative, which is unprecedented, and that's all a factor of the traders trading the contracts. But no, I've never seen it drop that fast. In 1986, it dropped from December of 85 to June of 86. It dropped from $40 a barrel to $10 a barrel. That's been kind of the most dramatic price drop although in 2008 it dropped from 100 to 130 to about 40. So that's a pretty dramatic price drop as well. So
yeah, and so there's a drop, but just in our case, it happened to happen really fast.
right.
But the producers compensate on the back end, and I kind of think people don't think they think that I don't know, maybe it's like the Beverly Hillbillies where the oil's just pop flying out of the ground. It's just you can't stop it. And now you've got to start selling it, and that's why you'll pay people to take it away. But that's not actually what happens. I mean, that's kind of, I think, the perception everybody got from reading the headlines, that you guys don't have any choice but to pump this oil. But you do have a choice. So you're slowing demand down, supply down to compensate for demand. But, of course, now that we know we're this far down and we know that things are going to change demand-wise, hopefully, positively. They will eventually. Things are going to go back up, and then you can start doing this again. The problem, of course, is for any operators that weren't in a position to be able to stop, that they have to produce something no matter what people are buying it for because they have debts. Even you have to keep producing some to pay your expenses.
Right. So there are oil operators, there are oil leases that you can just shut them in and come back 6 months later and turn them on, and they're fine. But it's more the fact. It's more common that if you shut a well in that's making 100 barrels a day, when you come back to turn it on, it's not going to be making but 5 barrels a day. So that's a geologic thing. That's the rock characteristics, especially in shale wells. The shale wells plug themselves up, and they, maybe making 1,000 barrels a day when you shut it in. But if you shut it in for 6 months, and when you come back, it's not going to be making anything. We lost a well to Hurricane Katrina that way. It was a natural gas well down on the Gulf Coast, and when those hurricanes come on shore, they have to shut the wells in, and so they secure them up, put locks on them, and things like that. So they did that, and when they came back to turn the well on, there was nothing there. It didn't produce. They worked it over, tried to suck the gas out again, and try to get it flowing again. And we had to plug that well, so that cost us several $1,000s. Yeah. So that's one of the risks you run into whenever you shut a well in. That's why I don't want to shut my wells in. I want to keep producing just a little bit if I have to. I mean, if I can. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And so anyway, I hope that explains to people. And I know this is a very weird episode of the Distinctions for Life podcast, not a podcast, not yet. But this is the kind of thing I find fascinating, is understanding an industry that I didn't understand before. I remember when I became a paramedic and understanding EMS, it was like, you kind of have an idea how ambulances work, and more than likely you're wrong. Especially because one of the things I learned about EMS is it's all local. So the way EMS works in Houston, and the way EMS works in Abilene, and then the way EMS works somewhere like Big Spring, for instance, and that'd be a good example of even a smaller town, are vastly different. They are very different. Different hospital systems, different ways of doing ambulances, different people to staff those ambulances. And then everybody has a different medical director that makes different rules. Like that was one of the things that came out during the pandemic in New York. Is this news story came out that the fire department, which I think does EMS in New York, and I'm sure any of my EMS friends will correct me when I say this story and it's wrong. They reported that they would stop transporting people who had heart attacks, and people were like going, "Oh, because of COVID, you're going to let people die," but the point that's just a change in protocol. When I was in Houston, the protocol said that if you did what we called advanced life support, so you did the whole 9 yards, drugs, everything you could possibly do to start someone's heart back up, electricity, the whole thing. If you did that and their heart didn't start back up, you didn't transport them. You just declared them on spot. And you could do that because medical directors allowed that in Houston. But if you're in Abilene, or at least when I moved here, and this is like 7 or 8 years ago, but I'm pretty sure these protocols are the same, that then you always had to bring the body. That's how they would say it in Houston. You had to bring the body to the hospital and have a doctor say they were dead. Not that there was anything more the doctor could do, because they were doing it. You do the same thing in the hospital that EMS was doing on scene. So that was just a difference in protocol. And my bet is that New York was that way. They had the Abilene version of that protocol, and then they're like, we don't need a whole bunch of dead people being brought to our hospitals, right? So let's just change the protocol and let the paramedics declare it in the field. But that's not the way the news sees it. So it's the kind of the same way with the oil field, where everybody's like, oh, it's $- and you're thinking, oh, now my friend who owns an oil well is having to pay somebody. It's like, no, that's not really the way it's working. So that's why I wanted to do this.
I got several calls during that time, that week or two, whenever the prices were going negative, and they said, yeah, how can we take advantage of this? And I said, well, if you have some storage, you can go buy a contract and take delivery. You can do that. I mean, if you have enough room to store 1,000 barrels, you can go do that. And if you want to do that, that's fine. And somebody in Chicago will pay you to take those barrels, but you got to be ready for it, because they don't just deliver it to your front door and then you put it in your front yard. It's not that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think I mentioned that. I'm like, okay, so is there storage for sale right now? Because that would be the great. If you had storage, you could buy this really cheap oil. Actually, you don't even have to buy it, right? Like you said, like someone will literally pay you to go take it away. At least people from Chicago, just to get that contract off the books.
Yeah, that's right. So they get out.
But of course, nobody has that storage, right? Like if you had that storage, there was a reason you don't want to hold. That's the thing. It's kind of like having an oil well. Like you don't want to have storage that's sitting empty. That's an asset that's not doing what you need it to do. So you've already been doing that. Now it's not. You don't have. There's not excess capacity sitting around in storage at the moment.
It's interesting that the people who run the federal the oil storage reserve for the National Petroleum Reserve for the U.S. government, they missed a real opportunity. They could have gone out and bought 25 million barrels of crude oil and put it in their storage, because they had room, and had people pay them to take the oil. They could have done that, and they could have taken delivery of it. They missed the opportunity. The federal government actually missed a huge window there, and they're actually getting geared up to do it this month, because the same thing is going to happen this month that happened last month.
Right, because some of these contracts that are upside down were written years ago to be delivered next month, right? That's actually going to be happening for a little while, right? Like well, in theory, I guess it could happen for years, except the oil price will go up eventually. Because you've got contracts right now. You've got contracts that won't come due for 3 years out there in the market.
I can buy contracts 10 years in the future right now if I wanted to.
Yeah.
They're at $50 a barrel, and I don't necessarily want to buy $50 a barrel when I can buy oil today at $17 a barrel. Right. But in the future, the price is projected to be back up in the 50s or 60s, and maybe even higher.
Yeah, yeah, and that's all variable, right? Like that. It depends on.
That's one of the exciting things for us is when people get in a jam in the oil business, you can buy production oil in the ground for $2 to $3 a barrel, lift it up for $10, and now you got a $13 barrel sitting on the ground. In the future, you can sell that barrel for $50. So if you buy production now, but make the investment to buy production when things are bad and everybody's abandoning the marketplace, then in the future you'll be able to prosper greatly from that.
And you buying future production? So like you're saying, in 6 months I want to buy whatever your well produces, but in 6 months from now, not from next month. I want to buy it in 6 months, and I'll pay you $2 now.
Actually, we're buying the oil wells.
Okay.
So they'll produce, and if we do the proper technology on them, they'll produce for another 20 years. So over the next 20 years, that oil is going to sell for who knows what. I mean, up into the hundreds. So you're buying oil in the ground for $3 a barrel, and you're trying, and eventually you're going to sell it for $100 a barrel.
Right.
And it's going to be stored in the ground. You don't have to have storage to keep that oil because it's in the ground. All you have to do is have the ability to manage it and produce it.
Right.
Very dynamic time in the business.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah.
And normally this is the part where I say, "Hey, Paul, what do you want people to do?" But I kind of know exactly what you want them to do because that's what I've done. So, let me tell people some information about Custom Private Equity Podcast, and then I will close out the podcast. But thank you for being on the show, Paul.
Great. Thank you very much, Ron. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
All right. So about custom private equity. So there is a podcast, the Custom Private Equity Podcast. You can find it in Apple iTunes. Also, you can go to the website, customprivateequity.com, and there's lots of resources that Paul has written about this particular era and what's going on and that kind of stuff, and you can get those for free as well. URLs right there. And I better check the comments. Okay. And so you can go do that, and we come out with a new episode fairly often. We're still starting up, but if you want to learn not just about oil, but also about other forms of private equity, you can go to Custom Private Equity, subscribe to the podcast, and I'd encourage you to do that as well. If you are interested in the kind of stuff that Distinctions for Life normally does, which is helping people get what they really want in life with small changes that make a big difference, you can subscribe to this channel on YouTube. If you're watching on Facebook, you can follow us on Facebook as well. I come out with new, what I call Distinctions videos every Sunday. And they have a variety of things, but they're sort of small nuggets of information, small changes that can make a big difference in your life. I would encourage you to subscribe to those. I also put out an email every Friday that has like 5 tools. It has a tool, a YouTube channel, a book, and something to think about. That comes out every Friday. If you'd like to get that, you can go to the distinctionsforlife.tv website. And I know this is all a bunch of stuff that you can do. I just want to give you lots of options. If you're confused and don't know what to do, go to distinctionsforlife.tv, and you can find out everything there is to find out about Distinctions for Life. Thank you for being here today, and I will be doing a live stream on Thursday with Dr. Duncan Pelly from McMurray University. He's the professor of entrepreneurship there, and we are going to talk about entrepreneurship. So I would encourage you to turn on that notification bell as well for that live broadcast at 2 p.m. Central Time, right here on the same place you're looking at right now. And until next time, I'm your host, Ron Davis.